Okay, is everybody muted? Yes, great. Well, thank you all for joining us today in this Who is My Neighbor series. I think we just gain so much when we hear what's going on in our community and what's going on, the issues that are affecting and confronting our Denver city and the metro area. And just grateful that all of you could be part of this. We're recording this because several folks I know who actually work during the day are wanting to hear the outcome, and they're wanting to hear this presentation and couldn't be with us. So that's why we're recording. And also Cole Chandler, who is our speaker today, sent some flyers or leaflets, some more information, and we'll also be providing that in that email that goes out on Friday. And we'll have those if you'd like to print those or take a look at them. I think you'll find them just extremely informative. But I want to thank Cole Chandler very much for being our speaker today. And Cole is the executive director of the Colorado Village Collaborative. If you go to their website, you'll just see all sorts of amazing information. But Cole, this is what it says about Cole. He's an organizer, activator, and community builder who serves as the executive director of the Colorado Village Collaborative. He holds a Master's of Divinity degree from Baylor University, is an ordained minister and a member of the Denver Catholic Worker community. A moral commitment led Cole into his work among the poor and marginalized people, where he found himself to have become a part of a community whose struggle became his own. So before we get started, I just want to let you know how we're going to work this presentation today. Is that we're going to give Cole about 35 to 40 minutes to give a presentation. And please, if you want to take notes of any questions, you can post questions in the chat box. And then after he's done with his presentation, we'll have a facilitated conversation around any questions you might have. And you can post in the chat box, or we can take your questions afterwards. And so I want to open first with a prayer. And this is from our Book of Common Prayer for Social Justice. Grant, O God, that your holy and life-giving spirit may so move every human heart, and especially the hearts of the people of this land, that barriers which divide us may crumble, suspicions disappear, and hatred cease. That our divisions being healed, we may live in justice and peace. Through Jesus Christ, our Lord. Amen. So thank you, Cole, for being here. And I'm just going to turn it over to him.
All right. Thank you so much. It's great to be with you all. And I will share my screen and go ahead and jump into my presentation here. All right. All right, is everybody seeing that? Thumbs up if it is showing up for you. All right, great. So the title of this presentation is a bold one. How does a homelessness crisis infect the wealthiest nation in history? And so, as we're having this conversation today, I'm going to tell you about the organization that I helped to run and helped to co-found. But I also want to give us a little bit of a global 30,000 foot perspective to just understand what is the issue of homelessness, how has it risen up to such a degree in the United States, and what are some paths forward for us, and how can we be involved? So that's really our intention, is to explore the problem and think about some ways that we can become a part of the solution together. Linda shared a little bit of my background, but just to reiterate a couple of those items, I'm a person of faith. I am an ordained minister. and I was ordained by the Mennonite Church, actually. I have spent time serving in churches, but really at this point in my life have felt sort of a call to do my work in public, in the public sector, and have had the opportunity through leading the Colorado Village Collaborative to work closely with government and with community to deliver on a way of living in greater dignity and care for our neighbors. But really, my entry point into this work was through the Denver Catholic Worker. I moved into the Denver Catholic Worker House back in 2014. And for those that aren't familiar, the Catholic Worker is a grassroots model that started in New York City in the midst of the Great Depression. And I think it's important that we kind of remember the context of the Great Depression as we're sort of looking at homelessness and where it is right now in our country. But that time period was not so unlike the time period that we're living through right now. Obviously, great job loss, great levels of instability all across the country, and basically. In New York City in the 1930s, there were a couple people, Dorothy Day and Peter Marin, who started a newspaper that was, left-leaning social justice newspaper. They started writing these articles, and people started showing up at their door and saying, "Hey, I read your paper. Do you have some food? Can you feed me? And hey, do you have a place I can stay?" And what Dorothy says in her autobiography is that we couldn't say to them, "Go, be thou fed." She said that we had to make soup lines. We had to make houses of hospitality. And so it was really just this grassroots effort, just this desire to meet the needs of the neighbors or the strangers at the door that propelled that movement. It spread across the country. In Denver, the Catholic Worker opened in 1978. It was in a 9-bedroom house in the historic Five Points neighborhood, right across the street from the Blair Caldwell Library. When I moved into that house in 2014, the gentrification of Five Points was just beginning. It was just underway. Many of the street blocks along Welton Street were undeveloped, vacant lots at that time. And I sat on the front porch of that house and watched deals being done and watched high-rise buildings going up. And I learned about the struggle of homelessness from my housemates that were going out into the city every day, where they were met with little more than a cold shoulder. And so over time, that led to the development of the Colorado Village Collaborative, which I'll tell you more about. But just wanted to give you a little bit of my personal background. This is a clip from a video that was used as part of Interfaith Alliance National's Your Vote, Your Values campaign ahead of the November 2020 election, but it just shares a little bit about my story. So the framework for this presentation is built around 4 key questions, which I think are really important when we think about delivering on social change. And so we'll kind of go through these questions, but the first question is just, what is the world like? Obviously, in order to create solutions, I think we have to have a deep understanding of problems. And so that first part is really based on trying to get into the problems. To go a bit further into this, in the second section, we'll think about how did these problems develop? So what is the world like? How did the world get this way? The next step is to think about what could the world be like, to imagine what is possible. And then the fourth step is how do we get there? How do we build systems? How do we organize to make that kind of world possible on the face of the earth? So this first section, what is the world like? And so I just want to explore a bit of the problem of homelessness in our country. And so I emphasize that this is a national problem. Often I think we've failed nationally because we've tried to see homelessness as a local issue. The reality is that people experiencing homelessness, they don't obey the borders of a city. They don't obey the borders of a county. And they certainly don't obey the borders of a region either. And so this is a national issue that's growing in our country. And so every single night in America, we have over 560,000 people sleeping outdoors. And nationally, we have a 7.5 million unit shortage of affordable housing. And so I just want to take a minute to kind of let those numbers sink in, because those are the largest numbers that we've had in our country since the Great Depression. Locally, we know that there's more than 6,100 people experiencing homelessness in Metro Denver. And one of the numbers that I care most about is the number of people that are unsheltered. As a person of faith, my sort of, I don't know, my heart in this space goes out to those that are most on the margins. And so the folks that are without access to shelter, or those that are unsheltered, living in camps in our neighborhoods, really struggling to meet their basic needs. There's over 1,500 of those in Metro Denver. We also have an extreme unit shortage of affordable housing units. And so there's more than 90,000 units that we need to build or preserve in Metro Denver in order to meet the need of those without housing, or those that are on the brink of losing their housing because they're income burdened. So another thing that is important to note is that these numbers will only grow due to the pandemic. So there are national models that project that from the onset of the pandemic in late spring of 2020 through the summer of 2021, we will see a 45% increase nationally in the cases of people experiencing homelessness. Colorado currently has an eviction moratorium that's scheduled to roll off the books at the end of this year. And so there are many households that are facing an eviction cliff due to job loss or lost income throughout the pandemic. So that's a little bit about the problem, but let's explore kind of how the problem developed, how it got this way. And so this is a little bit of a flow chart that I use to kind of look at what are the causes, both systemic and structural and individual, that lead someone into homelessness. And then what are the solutions, both systemic and structural and individual, that can lead someone out of homelessness. So this is just a basic flow chart showing those entry points at the macro and micro level, and exit points at the macro and micro level. So I'll start here with some of the macro and structural causes of homelessness, and you can kind of see a list here, and I'll just go into and explain a few of these here. This is an article from 2017 that I've continued to refer back to when I've spoken about the homelessness crisis. This was in Bloomberg Business Week. It was an article that explored the story of a woman who was a community college professor in the LA area, but was sleeping in her car every single night because she couldn't afford housing in her city. And so basically what the article argues is that the increase in homelessness that we're experiencing is because wages are stagnant and housing prices have skyrocketed. And so I think, this conversation often gets centered in different areas. We often talk about mental health. We talk about people's individual choices. I think it's really important to just kind of start by identifying that this is a housing crisis and it's an economic crisis. And so because wages have been stagnant, wages have grown at 1 to 3% annually since the 1950s or so, and housing prices have grown at 5 to 10% annually. We are beginning to see this cliff where in Denver, we're 90,000 units short of affordable housing units. So this is just, I've pulled out a few lines from this article here, and you can kind of take a look at those. But this report here that's shown was actually from Zillow, and it came out at the same time. So Zillow, national real estate companies certainly have no interest in talking much about homelessness or how the real estate market is contributing to that. They did a study of major cities all across the country, and they found that for every percentage point of increase in rent, there was a direct correlation to the numbers of people experiencing homelessness in cities. And so this is just a data point that drives home that reality that wages are stagnant and housing prices have skyrocketed, and that's the major contributing cause of homelessness. These numbers that are on your screen are Denver specific numbers. Another thing that the article points out is that in the late 1970s, early 1980s, we made drastic cuts to our federal housing budget in this country. And so this is a chart here that shows that basically since right around 1980, we have not put more money into our federal housing budget for new construction, and we have really failed to preserve our existing units as well. And so the problem that we're facing at this point is a problem that's 4 decades in the making. It really started in 1980. We haven't always had mass homelessness in this country. And I think one of the things that's important to point out is that people experiencing homelessness did not create mass homelessness. We actually created that as a society through the choices that we've made in terms of the way we structure our economy and our social service systems. Obviously, another thing that's really important to point out is the racial wealth gap. And so we know that while white folks, control about 90% of the nation's wealth, they are not 90% of people living in this nation. And so different practices over time, like slavery, practices like redlining, practices like the sort of incarceration of people of color have contributed to a growing racial wealth gap that's left people of color vulnerable in terms of their housing experience. And so we see that people of color are disproportionately represented in the homelessness population, both locally and nationally. So that's a bit of kind of some of those macro level issues. And I'll dive into some of these micro level personal issues that cause a person to move into homelessness as well. So the first thing that I always point out is that from an individual and personal level, one of the leading causes of homelessness is adverse childhood experiences. And so if you've never heard of the ACEs study, this is a study that was commissioned by Kaiser Permanente in the 1990s. They were looking at middle income folks who had some really poor health outcomes later in life. And what they did was they started asking questions to these folks about things that happened to them in their childhood. And so they asked a series of 10 questions. They weren't worded exactly like this, but it was more or less, did you experience physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect? Were you treated violently? Was there a person in your house that abused alcohol or drugs? Was someone in your household incarcerated? They asked all these kinds of questions of middle income adults. And they found that for every time a person said yes and scored a point on their scale, they were more likely to have poor health outcomes as an adult. And so one of the things that's really interesting was that they also found that these individuals were more likely to experience homelessness for every point that they scored as well. And so we know that homelessness, even when things happen in an individual's life, are not always because of choices that an individual made. It's often because of the experiences that they grew up surrounded by. People on our streets were abused by a parent, mentally, physically, emotionally, sexually. People on our streets grew up in households where parents were separated or divorced or misused substances, or maybe one person from the paternal relationship was in prison. And so all those kinds of things over time lead to a person winding up experiencing homelessness at some point in their lifetime. Another thing that's obviously a leading cause of homelessness is mental illness and addiction. But one of the things that I also like to point out when we're talking about mental illness and addiction and homelessness is that while it is true that someone may wind up on the streets because they are experiencing mental health issues, it's also true that sleeping on the streets in a world where it seems like no one cares about you results in mental health issues and addiction. And so it's not just a causality relationship where someone has a mental illness and winds up on the streets. It's also the case that living on the streets in that kind of environment, sleeping on the concrete, not knowing where to store your things, feeling vulnerable all the time, those lead to poor health outcomes over time. And so these are just some of the causes that lead someone into homelessness. Um, but, and sorry, one other thing to add is that we can see that homelessness is not an isolated crisis. It's a crisis within a set of crises. And so we've explored a bit of the housing crisis, the economic crisis, but really this broader social crisis. And one of the things that I would point out is that, you know, for me, if I lost everything today, if I lost my job, my house, my family, uh, my income, all those kinds of things, I would still have people that I could call that would take care of me. The reality is that for folks that wind up in homelessness, it's because they have reached the end of that rope and they have no one left that they can call. And so really it is a breakdown of relationships that ultimately lead someone to wind up spending their first night on the streets or in a shelter. So we've explored a bit of the problem, and now it's time to just kind of dream a bit and think about what could the world be like. And I think it's helpful as we think about that to just sort of ground ourselves in an image. And so here's an image to me of what the world could be like. These are three women that were all experiencing unsheltered homelessness before moving into the beloved community tiny home village. When they moved into the village, they all experienced significant increases in their levels of well-being and satisfaction, their level of empowerment and autonomy and engagement. All three of these women went on to become employed to gain permanent housing. And so to me, this is a little image of what the world could be like. The world could be a place for community. It could be a place for relationship. It could be a place for empowerment. It could be a place where people take care of one another and our basic needs are met and we're able to thrive. And so that's the kind of world that we're working to build at the Colorado Village Collaborative. So we believe in a philosophy of housing first, that people don't deserve housing and work their way up to housing, that all people need a safe place to call home. And so we try to provide basic housing resources to people, but that's not the end of what we're doing. We are also surrounding people with the supportive services that they need, and we're working towards building long-term change and positive outcomes in people's life. And so housing is first, but it's not where we end. And then just to kind of hit on the broader social crisis, another thing that I see when I look at that image of those three women at the tiny home village is an image that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke of and the late John Lewis spoke of. It's an image called the beloved community. And I think that the thing that's beautiful about MLK's vision for the beloved community was that he didn't see it as a lofty utopian goal. He thought that the beloved community was something that could be achieved. He actually believed that there could be a world without poverty and hunger and homelessness, without racism and hatred and war. And that's the kind of world that he was working to build every day. And so that is just kind of the image of the world that we're working for as well. So how do we get there? You know, that's a really big question. And I think there are so many things that need to be done. But obviously, the things that need to be done, if they are going to be commensurate with the causes, need to be macro as well as micro. So we need to create macro systemic structural change in order to ultimately create change within the system. And we also need to do the things that help the individuals within that system restore their lives. And so you can kind of see some of the sort of macro structural items that we need here: housing, education, healthcare, jobs, criminal justice reform, supportive services. And then at a micro level, some personal will, some personal healing, community, and empowerment. And so when we think about building solutions, I talked a little bit about the housing first model. This is a national model that's been a best practice. We have been able to successfully solve homelessness in certain populations in our country, especially veterans and older men. We've been able to solve it through housing first kinds of interventions, but now those kinds of things need to be scaled all across the country to not just subgroup populations. And so housing first, restoring the federal housing budget, those are some of the basic building blocks that need to fall into place. Similarly, we need a different healthcare system, and we've seen that very clearly during this pandemic. We've seen, the same disparities that show up time and time again in our country have shown up during the pandemic. So we know that people of color have been disproportionately affected by COVID-19. We know that frontline workers are most vulnerable, are low-wage workers. And we know that the healthcare system just isn't working for really anyone except for big insurance companies. And so, we've got to rebuild some of the basic blocks of that if we really want to be the kind of society that takes care of everyone. We also need a different education system, and we've seen some of the fractures and fissures within that system during the pandemic as well. We've seen families that may not have access to wireless internet or have a single parent household, or parents that have lost their jobs during the pandemic that have struggled to keep up with the education system. And so we know that system needs repair too. And we also know that we need racial justice, and we need to improve the way that communities and police interact with one another. And we need to, build all of our systems in an equitable way that center the lives of poor and marginalized folks. And so, there are macro level changes that need to occur. And there are personal changes that need to occur as well. And so that kind of comes to the end of that set of questions, but I did want to share just a bit about how CBC and my organization is working for change. We can't all participate in the changing and shaping of those kinds of systems all of the time, but there's something that all of us can do to create the kind of world that we believe in. And so just to share a little bit about our story, our organization started really for me on the front porch of the Catholic Worker House, just doing deep community listening, listening to the voices and experiences of people coming off the streets, understanding how our city's policies were affecting people who were struggling. Back in 2016, we started doing some coalition building through the Interfaith Alliance of Colorado. We brought together several different organizations to work to bring about something new that had never been done before, to try to bring about a tiny home village. And at the end of 2016, we were able to secure land through a private landowner. And we had a path forward for creating a tiny home village. In 2017, we formed the Colorado Village Collaborative. We built 11 tiny home units on donated land. We worked with the city and government to establish a zoning pathway. And we launched this project that, we were hopeful for, but we didn't know what kind of outcomes we would see. Now in 2020, we have built 22 new homes this year. We're just opening 14 homes this week. And we're also working on some other programs that are specific to COVID-19. Our vision is for scaling tiny home villages across the metro area. We'd love to have 10 villages spread out around Denver, serving neighbors coming from unsheltered homelessness. So just to give you a sense of some of the projects that we're working on, this is a photo of the beloved community tiny home village. It's 19 units. Over the years, it's served 32 unique people. 11 of those have now transitioned into permanent housing. And that's the kind of outcome and pathway that we're looking for. During the pandemic, we're also working to create safe outdoor spaces or temporary managed campsites. And so some folks may have heard about those or seen those in the news. This is a model site that we stood up in Capitol Hill around the 1st of October, just to show people an idea of what a safe managed campsite would look like. We know that the numbers of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness have greatly increased from 2019 to 2020. The federal point in time data showed that the numbers of people living on our streets in Denver doubled from around 500 to 996 in 2020. And that was pre-pandemic. When the pandemic onset, our shelter capacity in Denver reduced by 57%. And so we've seen an additional increase of those sleeping outdoors. And that's caused great harm and stress for those individuals and also for people in neighborhoods, causing all kind of conflict and tension. And so our organization has tried to promote a different way rather than just policing people, rather than just throwing people's things away, but a way to actually provide dignity and stability and resources to people that are living in encampments. And it's been a process that's been met with a lot of opposition. And so at the beginning of October, we hosted a community event just to help people imagine what something different might look like. And we did that in partnership with Belong Church at 16th and Ogden. We are now moving this project forward, and we'll be opening the first safe outdoor space at First Baptist Church of Denver sometime next week. And then the week following, we'll be opening the second at Denver Community Church at 16th and Pearl. Another thing that we work on is some education and advocacy work. And so earlier this year, we helped to do some early research on a ballot initiative that became 2B on the Denver ballot. And the Denver voters approved it by about 65% of the vote. And it will become a $40 million revenue source for housing and homelessness resources in the city moving forward in 2021 and beyond. So it's a permanent $40 million revenue source dedicated solely to addressing housing and homelessness. It's a great tool, and it's not enough. Housing and homelessness is a multi-billion-dollar problem in our country, and some local resources are really important, but we've got to bring on some federal resources as well. So just to share a little bit about our outcomes, I mentioned earlier, we're actually up to 32 people and 11 graduates now. We've provided nearly 14,000 nights of shelter, and 0 people that have moved into our tiny home villages have chosen to return to homelessness. Those numbers are great, but really it's about people's stories. And so there's 3 stories here that I like to share. One is Rhonda. She's on the left. She's a woman who was living in on the banks of the South Platte River in a camp when we started construction on the beloved community tiny home village. She came up to volunteer over the course of that summer that we built that village, and she helped really build her own house that she moved into, and then later became our first graduate into permanent housing. The guy in the middle is Ray. He was a veteran. He started experiencing homelessness shortly after he came out of the Marines in his early 20s, and experienced homelessness for on and off for 4 decades. When he moved into the tiny home village, he hadn't had an ID in 30 years. He was able to get an ID. He was able to gain employment, and he was ultimately graduated from the village into permanent housing. And then the woman on the right is Scylla. She's one of the numerous transgender individuals who are struggling without shelter in our city. 30% of folks that are transgender that are experiencing homelessness are unsheltered because they don't feel safe in shelter-based environments. And so it's really important to us that we make a significant effort to make space for that population within our spaces. Scylla was also one of our graduates from the beloved community village. I have a little story here, a video. I think I'm going to take my headphones off so that you can hear it when I hit play. But this is a little bit of Rhonda's story. And so I'll just kind of let this sink in. And then I will be happy to pause and have a conversation.
Hear people talk about people who experience poverty, people who experience homelessness, people who experience, as you know, they've done something wrong, you know, because of a bad decision. This is now how it is, and that's not really true.
Well, my mom died, so when she died, I mean, everybody kind of expected me to take on her role, and that got way overwhelming. So I just realized that in order for me to stay sober, I had to do something for myself. One day, I didn't even know it was coming. I just figured, I gotta go. This is gonna kill me if I stay any longer. So, yeah, I just went to the river and I found me a spot. So in a matter of 2 days, my life changed. Didn't realize I was going to be living in a village, in a tiny home. I was signed up for construction. I got my own hard hat. And after that, day by day, I'd go back up to the village, build my tiny home. I got my own tiny home. And not long after that, I started going to a supportive women's group, and my self-esteem started rising, and I had a sense of family, and boom, I got my own apartment. It was bittersweet. It was like, wow, I got my own apartment. The other part was just a sense of community, because I already started bonding with, you know, my neighbors at the village. So it was like a reason to live. It was like a flourishing time in my life. I just felt like good about myself. I just felt a sense of belonging, and it was sincere. It wasn't just these people that I'm going to be passing through in life. I feel like this is like a permanent fixture in my life. They're not leaving, you know, they're not leaving. And I'm not leaving, which is more important.
We've been on this location for over 100 years. We've been involved with a lot of things, including providing meals and shelter to the children in the neighborhood. We have housed women through the Women's Homeless Initiative in the basement. We do not confine ourselves to the insides of this church. So we will be building 8 tiny houses and making them available to women and members of the trans LGBTQ community, as those are 2 demographics that are particularly vulnerable on the streets, and for which the sheltering and services are particularly sparse. It'll be located right outside the north door of our church, like within 10 feet.
It's so important to me because I was a part of the beginning of it, and I want it to flourish. I want it to flourish, and I don't want it to just be covered up, just put a lid on it and call it a day. I want it to flourish still. There's still a lot to be done, and a lot more can be done, you know.
It's about building a community and saying we do this in part because it is the best thing for our greater community. When you support this project, you are supporting a community where people can thrive.
All right, so just a tiny caveat, that video is a little bit outdated. We made that in partnership with St. Andrew's Episcopal Church when we were working to locate a tiny home village on their land. Unfortunately, that project wasn't able to go forward because of zoning restrictions, landmark preservation restrictions, just some of the structural elements that prevent people from living in housing. But I have good news. The story ends well, because literally just yesterday we opened that village with not only 8 units, but 14 units on a piece of land that's just about 8 blocks from my house where I'm sitting right now. And just today, we had the first 2 people move into the space. We'll be moving people in every day throughout the next week. There are 2 women that moved in. Both are 20 years old. And one of them spent last night in a stairwell, and the other one spent last night in an abandoned warehouse. And today they have their own tiny home that they'll be spending the night in. So that's just a little bit of kind of the fulfillment of a long path, but we're really grateful that that project is launched. So thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you. And I am more than happy to just move into a time of conversation.
Thank you, Cole. That's you presented just a lot of great information for us to digest and ponder. And so I want to open it up to anyone who might have some questions for Cole about the homelessness issues that he addressed early in his presentation, or any one of the projects that are currently going on in Denver, the tiny homes, the safe outdoor space. If you have any questions, please raise your hand. Okay. Yes, Sandy Barrientos, go ahead and unmute yourself.
Cole, I'm Sandy, and it's nice to meet you. I'm not clear on the difference between homelessness and unsheltered. Could you tell me, because you've talked about them and as if they were two different.
Yeah.
things.
So we do a point in time count every year that does the best we can to determine the number of people that are experiencing homelessness in cities all across the country. So I shared a number that was 6,100 in the metro area. What that count does is it looks at, so someone's experiencing homelessness, I mean, if they don't have a home, right? But many people are accessing different kinds of services. Some people are spending the night in emergency shelters. Some people are spending the night in transitional housing. Those people are technically still considered homeless. If you're living in an emergency shelter, if you're living in transitional housing, you still don't have a permanent address. You're experiencing homelessness.
Okay.
The number that I emphasized additionally is people that are unsheltered. So these are people that are not accessing services. They're sleeping outdoors in camps. They're sleeping in abandoned buildings, places that are not fit for human habitation. And so that number is just sort of a subcategory of the broader number of people experiencing homelessness. So when you think, I mean, most of the time when we think about someone experiencing homelessness, what our mind often goes to is someone standing on the street corner flying a sign, or someone in a tent, near the Capitol. Those folks are experiencing unsheltered homelessness in particular. They're some of the most vulnerable within our society.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your questions, Sandy. Anybody else with questions? Yes, Nancy, please unmute yourself.
Okay, thanks. Can you hear me okay? Oh, good. Cole, I was curious about what has changed on the Colorado ballots. I recall it was a year or two ago, there was a ballot initiative, I think, that was kind of around making overnight camping in public spaces legal. And I think that one was voted down. But then you talked about here recently with another initiative that was supported. I wonder if you can just kind of walk through what is in this latest initiative and what we can do as members of the electorate to support public initiatives.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. So the first initiative that Nancy's referring to, these were both Denver ballot initiatives. It was called Initiative 300 in the May 2019 election. And it was called the Right to Survive Initiative or something like that. That would have granted the right for people to survive in public space without the threat of being moved, or the threat of having, police come along and move people along, or public works come along and move people along. So it would have given people the right to camp in public spaces. It didn't give people the right to sleep in private spaces, like to sleep on your yard. It didn't give people the right to sleep in doorways or places like that, but sort of like public right of way, various areas like that. It would have said, by right, people can live here. That was overwhelmingly defeated. 82% of the Denver vote went against it. It was one of the, largest defeats you could probably imagine. Not surprisingly, it was strongly out fundraised. So there was a no campaign that raised something like 2.5 million. And the yes campaign only raised about 100,000. So that's pretty significant. One other data point that I think is kind of interesting is that was on the Denver mayoral and city council ballot in 2019. There were actually more people that showed up to the ballot box to vote single issue and just voted on 300 than anything else. There were 300 received more votes, yes or no, than the mayor. So it was the thing that everybody showed up to vote for that year, and it was severely defeated. One of the things that law was trying to overturn is a law called the unauthorized camping ban. So in 2012, Denver passed a law called the unauthorized camping ban. It was on a very split 7-6 city council decision. And that law effectively states that it is illegal to eat, sleep with a blanket in public space. I personally am opposed to that law and have spent years organizing against that law. That being said, many people thought that 300 went too far, because I think it's immoral to criminalize someone for eating, for covering yourself with a blanket, for surviving the elements. But at the same time, 300 extended by right the ability to live in public space. And so it probably went too far. That's more than you wanted to know, but that's that law. There's been a couple initiatives that have supported people experiencing homelessness over the last couple of years. One was, and they're both sales taxes. So one was a 2018 ballot measure called Caring for Denver that was passed by about 2/3 of the voters. And it created a $40 million revenue source specifically for mental health services, for community-based mental health services across our city. So we know that, there's a significant need for mental health services, not just in poor, marginalized, and homelessness populations, but all across our society. And what that effort is intended to do is extend those services to those most in need. My organization receives some funding through that revenue source that's really critical to the folks that we serve. So that's one thing, a $40 million revenue source specifically for mental health services and supports. Then just now in November, the same 2/3 majority approved a new $40 million revenue source that is specifically for homelessness resolution and housing efforts. So it's intended to go towards creating units of housing, towards providing services for housing units, and it'll create $40 million every year. Now, when I say $40 million a year, that sounds like a lot of money to me. And I remember being at the table early in those conversations, thinking about, how amazing it would be to create $40 million. But then when you start thinking about how that gets sucked up, it gets sucked up pretty quick. I'll just say that. And it's not the case that all those funds, they renew every year, but if the city contracts $40 million in new contracts, they have to pay those again year after year after year. So it will create like this initial increase in our capacity, but it's not just going to create exponential capacity every year. And so we'll need additional tools as well. One other thing that happened in 2016 was that Denver created a 10-year, $300 million affordable housing trust fund. And so that fund is intended to create some additional opportunities for closing the gap on affordable housing financing. It doesn't come close to providing the entirety of the need, but it helps provide gap funding for projects that need it in the city. So we have a few of these tools that we're able to cobble together. The state of Colorado passed a housing trust fund in 2019, but in 2020, it failed to implement that fund in spite of the pandemic. And our current governor and his administration has not made housing a significant part of their platform. And that's a real deficit, considering it's the #1 issue facing our state.
Okay. Thank you, Cole. Yes, Reverend Sierra.
I just have a question around Colorado Village Collaborative's niche and relationship with other organizations in the city that are working toward sort of eradicating homelessness and the housing shortage, because I'm fascinated with the just the tapestry of organizations that are here that are doing amazing work. And so I'm curious, sort of, where do you see Colorado Village Collaborative within that tapestry?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So I think, for one, it's just really important to emphasize that housing occurs along a continuum, and sort of solving housing occurs along a continuum. So we need many different access points that help people get into the system, get the services that they need to ultimately get into housing. And we need lots more housing. So I think of it as trying to expand the front door into the system, but then also the back door in terms of the creation of housing units. So CVC, we fit along the front door of that continuum. We're trying to create low barrier entry points. A tiny home village is a low barrier entry point for somebody that isn't seeking shelter services or doesn't have access to shelter services for a variety of reasons. Maybe that's because they have a pet. We allow pets in our spaces. Maybe that's because they have a partner. We're the only organization that allows couples to stay within our sheltering environment. We're also a 24/7 environment, unlike many other shelters. So people don't have to take their things with them when they go out every day. They have a place they can store their belongings. And that leads to significantly better work outcomes for our individuals as well. So, and then our safe outdoor spaces are intended to be the same kind of thing along that front door continuum, and then trying to provide a strong back door through supportive services on into additional housing. Our mission is to bridge the gap between the streets and stable housing. So we have identified some of that gap population, and now we are working to try to meet the needs of those folks. But we do that in partnership. There's no single organization that can do all of this alone. There's no silver bullet cure. Tiny homes are not the solution. They're not the end all be all. Housing is what cures homelessness with supportive services. And we partner with all the major service providers around the city. There's a group called the Homelessness Leadership Council that consists of executive leadership from Urban Peak, from the Colorado Coalition for the Homeless, the Denver Rescue Mission, Catholic Charities, the Gathering Place, Dolores Project. I meet with all of those leaders 2 to 3 times every single week, and we're collaborating very much to try to work towards meeting the needs of our neighbors on the streets.
Thank you, Cole. Could you speak just briefly about the Clara Brown project?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a fantastic story, and I would invite all of you tomorrow afternoon at 3:30 p.m. We're hosting a opening celebration webinar that will be celebrating the opening of the Women's Village. But you got to see the video story of kind of the original vision for the Women's Village as it was constructed by St. Andrew's Episcopal Church and Deacon Webb Garfield. when that project fell through, we were looking for a site to build that project on. And one of the folks that I came into relationship with is Jeff Johnson, who's the executive director of Mile High Ministries. And he lives in the Cole neighborhood that's in Northeast Denver. And there'd been a piece of land that he had been visiting for 15 years, going to that site, praying for the land. What was on this site, it was a full city block, and it was just a bunch of dilapidated buildings that had been squatted for many years. I mean, it was a place of crime. There were fires, there were killings, all this kind of thing. And it was just a really a rough spot in the community. And Jeff will say he'd been going to this piece of land for 15 years, praying that it would be liberated from its current owner and given to Mile High Ministries so that they could do something good for the poor on this site. The previous owner of that site was a man by the name of Douglas Bruce, who is a pretty notorious Colorado slumlord and was actually the person that was responsible for passing TABOR, or the Taxpayer Bill of Rights. And there's a whole CPR mini series on him that I would recommend, but that's an aside. Anyway, in, I think it was like 2017 or 2018, the city actually took the land from that landowner and they put it up for auction. And Jeff Johnson had a donor who committed to winning the auction and then donating the land to Mile High Ministries. So this story of 15 years of prayer for this piece of land liberated that land, and their vision for the land long term is to build an affordable housing development on the site. And so on one side of the street, they'll do 65 units for affordable housing. On another side, they'll do 17 townhomes in partnership with Habitat for Humanity. And then on the piece of the land that we're currently occupying, they'll eventually do an early childhood education center or something like that that will serve the families in the neighborhood. But we're there temporarily on a 2-year lease, and we'll be able to activate the land. And women that move into the tiny home village hopefully will one day be able to move into the permanent housing that's built on the site while they're living there. Anyway, when they went through that whole process, Jeff and his board decided to rename that land in honor of Clara Brown. Clara Brown is the only African-American woman who was designated as an official pioneer by the state of Colorado. And if you haven't heard her story, she was born into slavery in the 19th century. She earned her freedom, came to Colorado, became an entrepreneur. She started laundry businesses in Central City during the gold rush. And then she kind of moved back down the hill to Denver, bought up a bunch of land, and became a settler in the Northeast Denver area. She then went back to the South and bought the freedom of several friends and family and brought them out to live on the land that she had acquired. And so she's just a wonderful woman and a philanthropist. And so it's really a redemptive story of taking something and redistributing those resources to the poor.
Thank you, Cole. What a great story. Thank you for sharing that. Well, unfortunately, we're at 3 o'clock, and it just time flew. And I just want to thank you, Cole, so much for being here with us and educating us on these issues, and so appreciate that very much. Again, this recording is going to be posted on Friday's email that will be coming out. We'll have the leaflets or flyers that Cole passed along, which I think are really interesting reading. And so also, I just want to say that as part of our thank you, St. Luke's has made a donation to the Colorado Village Collaborative as an honorarium. So
yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. And so Reverend Sierra, do you have any comments for us?
Yes, just to say that within the chat, I've posted a link to the launch party that Cole just referred to happening tomorrow, so that you can connect that way. And if you have any ideas for future speakers or topics for us as a church to be able to really delve into, please make it known to myself or Deacon Linda, because this is part of our calling of being the people of God and to be able to be the hands and feet of God in the world. So I bless you as you leave this space, and thank you for your time and your presence here this afternoon. God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Cole.